Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Naomi, and today I want to teach you how to do downward facing dog. So downward facing dog is one of the most foundational poses in yoga. You probably see it all the time, whether you are in a yoga studio taking a yoga class or whether you're here on YouTube and doing videos online. And downward facing dog is a really important pose because it gives you a lot of power for your legs, a lot of strength in your arms, and a lot of lengthening for your spine. It is a full body pose. The only problem is that sometimes we're not always taught the very best way to be in downward facing dog. It's sort of a pose that can be glossed over, particularly if you've been going to flow classes for a while, where some of those foundational elements might not be taught as well, or maybe it's been a while since you started yoga and you honestly can't remember. So this is a really quick video to help remind you of some of those really basic points of foundational alignment that will help you feel more stronger and more capable in downward facing dog. And also some tips to troubleshoot if you're feeling any stress in your wrists, in your shoulders, in your low back, or in any other part of your body, more likely your knees or your hips. So, all that said, you shouldn't need any props at all. I'm going to show you how to use blocks if you want to use blocks in downward facing dog, but you don't necessarily need them. All you really need is a mat and a wall space. And you should be good to go, okay? So come onto your hands and knees, come into table pose. Okay, the way that I like to teach downward facing dog to beginners, to everyone, is to start in table and then shift your hips back. Okay, now when you start in table, your hands are slightly ahead of your shoulders. Okay, the creases of your wrists are roughly even with the front edge of your mat. Now when I say your hands are as wide as your shoulders, I mean that outer width of your shoulders for most people. Okay, so if your hands are really, really narrow, it's going to make it a little bit tighter and trickier on your shoulders. If your hands are really, really wide apart, it's going to do the same. So you want to find that sweet spot, that sort of Goldilocks sort of sweet spot for this pose. And for me in general, that's just about at shoulder width apart, with the crease of my wrists even toward that short edge of my mat. My fingers point more forward than in, so you don't really want your hands pointing in toward one another, okay? You want them pointing more forward. Now once you're here, knees are slightly back from your hips. Curl your toes under and take your hips back towards your heels. Okay, now you don't want to sink all the way down like child's pose. Stay lifted and really press into your fingers powerfully, like squeeze the mat with your fingers. Okay, now keep squeezing the mat until you feel your forearms fire up, right? They start to engage, okay? Keep that engagement and then press back through your hips and lift your knees. Okay, so your knees are kind of hovering. Now this is hard on your legs for sure, but what it does is it takes your weight back into your legs more instead of being up in your upper body and your arms, which is where we tend to go. I'll show that in a sec. Okay, now with your knees bent, try to push your hips further back and maybe straighten one leg and then bend that leg and straighten the other. Now when you bend and straighten, notice what's happening to your upper body or your low back. If when you bend and straighten, you're shifting forward into your arms, keep your knees bent, right? And really press back through your hips. And that's going to help you distribute your weight a little bit more evenly between your arms and your legs. Okay, now walk your hands back to your feet. Come on into a forward bend. Bring your hands to your hips and come all the way up to stand. Okay, now to teach that action that you just did, that hips back action, you need a wall. Okay, I'm going to use a door because that's what I have, glass door, so, you have to clean it later. But you're going to come onto a wall and place your hands at the wall. Okay, then you walk your feet back until your hands are slightly above your shoulders and your feet are underneath your hips, maybe even slightly back, okay? Then you bend your knees, okay, just like you did on the ground. And with your knees bent, you can push your hips away from the wall. Now, you'll probably come up onto your fingertips or at the very least lift the heel of your hands away from the wall. That's okay, because you're really just teaching yourself this action of pressing back through your thighs. Then you can start to work your legs straighter by digging into your heels and lengthening back without losing the stretch and the length in your spine. Okay, and then walk yourself back up. Incidentally, that is a really great one also if you're feeling any low back drama. So wall dog is really good for that. But let's come back to downward facing dog on the floor. So, in downward facing dog on the floor, there are a lot of ways to get into downward facing dog. Like you can step back into it and all of that. I want to keep it pretty basic for today and just sort of go over the essential foundation. Now I'm going to turn really quickly and show you the alignment of my hands and dog. And I know it's sort of hard to see from where you are, okay? But what you want to avoid is hands turned in, okay? With my hands turned in, if I lift up, right, all of my weight is going to go into that space in my neck. So you don't want your hands turned in, okay? You want your hands to point more evenly forward. Okay, you don't necessarily want your hands to point out either. That's not a place that most people usually go, but you sort of want to avoid that too. Mostly just because it's hard to maintain, right? There's a lot happening, okay? It's not wrong. Okay, but hands even, okay? That's pretty important. The next thing that you want to think about is the action of your hands. So I'm really squeezing the mat with my fingers so I can build up the strength and the tenacity in my forearms. Right, so I'm building my foundation from the ground up, right? Fingers through the circumference of my palm, up through my forearm, up through my upper arm, and into my armpit. So my armpit stays nice and lifted, okay? Keeping that lift in my armpit. Hips are gonna go back just a little bit, knees go away from the floor. And I wanna keep this lift on my armpits instead of just letting them collapse down, right? So the objective isn't necessarily like how low can I get my chest to the floor. The objective for me in downward facing dog is how evenly can I distribute my weight, okay? How evenly can I distribute my weight between my hands, my arms, my hips, and my legs? Okay, so if my arms are collapsed down, then a lot more weight is going to be in my neck, in the insides of my arms, and eventually in my wrists, and none of it's in my legs. So if I press into my fingers and perk up my arms, lift up my armpits, okay, so they're nice and pit-like, like armpits are meant to be. Then I can bend my knees, lift my belly, and try to push my hips back without collapsing, right? So armpits stay lifted, push back. Okay, now here's something really important. It actually doesn't matter if you can get your heels to the floor or not, right? I can, but you don't have to. Having your heels lifted and your knees bent is a really, really great way to keep pressing back through your legs. Okay, it's a really great way to help you know where you can push and where you can get your power from, okay? Now, the big question that comes up a lot is how do you know your downward facing dog is the right length? Okay, now there's a pretty basic way to figure that out. And that way, sorry, hair. Ugh, so gross. Hair in my mouth, that's so disgusting. You know, I could just reshoot this video or I could keep going, and I'm going to keep going. So the way you can test it out in the most basic way is from plank pose, okay? So an easy way to get into plank is to extend left leg back with your arms still vertical directly over your wrists, lift up through your belly, right leg back too, so now you're in plank. Now if you bend your knees and press your hips back, that's going to take you roughly into a good downward facing dog length. Okay, now there are many reasons why you might not want to have a dog of this length. Okay, if your hands are a little bit closer in, that's going to put more weight into your legs, but it will also potentially tighten up around your neck and your shoulders, right? Because you're just a little bit tighter in downward facing dog. If your downward facing dog is longer, it's just asking more of your upper body. Okay, so if you want to work your upper body more, giving yourself a significantly longer downward facing dog is going to force you to do more work in your upper body. If you find that place where the weight is evenly distributed, which is generally like plank is just a good starting point for that, that's going to help you find that right length, that right place for your downward facing dog. Again, generally speaking, from a much more basic standpoint, okay? So you can always play a little bit with it and see what it feels like, how it feels, but generally speaking, plank is a good place to start, and then you can adjust from there based on what your body needs, okay? The other thing is generally when we think about shoulder width length. So if I take my arms out in front of me, this is about the length that I want my hands apart, about as wide apart as my shoulders. Not here, and not here, okay? Now when my hands are closer together, again, it just tightens up the front of my chest and my body, so it makes it a lot harder for me to stretch back into my hips, okay? When my hands are wider apart, I have a much wider foundation. Everything is really stretched out, and again, I kind of lose power from my foundation, right, in downward facing dog. So having my hands right underneath my shoulders, okay, or rather as wide apart as my shoulders, that's going to give me a little bit of a steadier downward facing dog. Okay, so that's generally speaking what I advocate. Now, if you have wrist issues or other things, like if you're going through some wrist stuff, what I don't recommend is putting your hands on blocks. Now you can put your hands on blocks for all kinds of other reasons. The downside of having your hands on blocks is that when your hands are on blocks, when you're this high up, although it does put more weight in your legs, which can be a benefit, it's really easy to sink back into the heel of your hand and dump more weight into your wrist. So the blocks aren't the best solution for that. They're great to play with for other things. They're really fun to add to a sun salutation, particularly if you're working on building up strength and you don't have any wrist drama. However, if you want to support your wrists a little bit more, what you can do, and it would be nice to have a second mat for this, what you can do is just roll up the front of your mat so that your fingers essentially are on a wedge. Okay, can't see because my hair's in the way. Okay, your fingers are on the floor and the heel of your hand is up on this wedge of your mat, and that's going to give your wrists a little bit of a lift. That's going to reduce the flexion of your wrists, which is really sort of what makes your wrists cranky, generally speaking, when they're in pain in downward facing dog, is that there's more wrist flexion. Okay, here there's less because it's at an angle. So when I go into downward facing dog, my wrist isn't doing quite as much of that, or my fingers aren't pulling back, so there's not quite as much weight in my wrists, and I can stretch out into my fingers more. And you could do the whole sun salutation that way. You can do a whole sun salutation that way. But it's a really, really simple way to sort of help your wrists out in downward facing dog. And again, some of the other, issues that'll come up, we've covered already, which is there can be a little bit of shoulder trauma if your hands are too close together, if your shoulders are collapsing down, or if your dog is really, really, really tight, if your feet are closer in towards your hands, and sometimes that can put more weight in your arms. Okay, another thing that will take the weight out of your arms is bending your knees, right? So the tendency, and this is why I advocate for coming from that angled, like puppy dog type pose instead of table. So when we lift up into table, or from table, we sort of go here first, right? Like in sort of this weird short plank, and then back to dog. Now, if you have fairly mobile hips and shoulders, that transition is no big deal. If you're a little bit tighter in your upper body or tighter in your hips, that transition is really hard. Okay, so instead of coming from table pose, right, and then lifting up and pushing back and maybe getting stuck in your upper body, coming from this elongated table, more of like a puppy dog, right, it's going to put more weight in your legs and it's going to ask more of them as you stretch back. Okay? So that's just another way to think of downward facing dog as you are getting a little bit stronger and more proficient with it. Okay, so hopefully that's given you some good food for thought and some just good foundational tips for your downward facing dog, so it feels a little bit more understandable, a little bit more clear, and so that you don't feel like you're not really sure what you're doing every time you put your hands and your feet on the mat. If you have any questions about downward facing dog that I didn't answer, please feel free to leave them in the comments below and let me know what other poses you want me to give you a how-to for. Doesn't matter how basic or how advanced, I would be happy to break down your favorite pose for you to make it a little bit simpler, a little bit more clear, and a little bit more empowering for you. So, thanks for tuning in today and doing a little downward facing dog with me, and I look forward to getting back on the mat with you again really soon. Until then, bye.